News Channel 8 presents New Skills for Living with your host, Tom Lavin, a healthy plan for healthy living.
Hello and welcome to New Skills for Living, a show dedicated to healing and wholeness in our community. Have you or your loved ones felt frustrated in your search for happiness? If you have felt frustrated, you're not alone. Have you felt sad? Have you felt unhappy? Have you felt angry? If so, you're not alone, although you might feel like you're alone and you're the only ones. We're going to be exploring this theme of health and happiness with Dr. Stephen Hayes today. Dr. Hayes is the foundation professor in the psychology department at the University of Nevada, Reno. He is the author of this really great book, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, which I highly recommend to you. And so as we're talking about this idea of health and happiness, we also later will want to be talking about Chinese handcuffs. And what do Chinese handcuffs, what can they teach us about being healthy and happy? So Dr. Hayes, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you back on the show. And so, Steve, the first thing that I want to ask you is, so many people, even if it seems like they have everything, they have financial security, they have a house, they have a car, but they're still striving to be happy. Can you tell us about that striving to be happy, please?
It's a natural process, but it's so easy to get into your own way with that, because I think we often define happiness by the emotional results of a process, and we try to get to that end point as opposed to actually walking through that process, and we short-circuit the possibility for real happiness. So are you kind of saying like that vaudeville comedian who said, don't try to make yourself happy, you're only going to make yourself miserable? Yeah, I think that there's a lot of evidence that that's true, because there's too many shortcuts that people can use that actually set up a process of internal struggle. And the culture is encouraging it massively, and it's not leading to real happiness. Really, the evidence seems to be that all of the material success that we've achieved over the last 100 years has not significantly contributed to our happiness here in the developed world. And would you say then that one of the things that makes us unhappy is that we're overly focused on, I have to be happy, and I need this to be happy, I need this, and everything's got to be a certain way, and then I'll be happy, and we think it's like a static state. We're going to be happy for the rest of our lives once everything gets in place? I think that's right, and you put life on hold, and you try to hold on to that, you kind of fix it in place. It's interesting that, I work with people who are addicted to drugs, and they call a hit of drugs a fix. Yes. And it's both a connotation of repair, but also to hold it in place. Yes. And happiness isn't like that at the emotional level. I think the Greeks had a pretty good term, eudaimonia, which is happiness defined as living your values. And that's something we can teach people how to do, and it leads to an expansion of life, not this kind of self-focus and focus on getting rid of part of the natural process of living, which is going to include pain and difficulty, and you've got to find a healthy place to put that rather than have that be defined as your enemy. Yeah. So when I hear you mention values, Steve, I'm thinking, well, sometimes maybe we're looking for love in all the wrong places. We get focused on something that we think is important, but maybe when we step back, it's really not that important. I think that happens all the time. But we get kind of mixed up, huh? Well, if you look around you and you see what are the things that people fight about at your work or at home and so forth, very often it's over who's up, who's down, who's right, who's in, and not really about what are the contributions that we're making to the lives of others. Are we connecting with those who are around us? They're really not about love, intimacy, participation, and contribution. They're about these more superficial things, and you're not going to find much happiness inside them. So when you're working as a psychologist with someone who's in pain and they're suffering, and you can see that they're kind of mixed up in terms of what's important, and maybe that's what's creating their suffering for them, how do you kind of talk with them about that so the light comes on for them? Well, one thing, I ask people to really look at their own experience, because we're so encouraged in our culture to define pain as something that has to go away. And yet loss and the natural process of aging, creating limits for us. There's lots of things that are painful in just a normal human life. If you define that as your enemy and then you start fighting with it, well then suffering is right behind that. And experience will teach you that, but the logical mind will want to continually try to define your life as a problem to be solved. That's exactly part of the process that makes it impossible for us to let go, show up, and start living, which is a formula that I think is more likely to lead to a more expansive life and a happier way of living.
Well, I kind of hear you saying that having pain is, from time to time, just part of the human experience, and the things that we do to try to make the pain go away actually create suffering. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, there's a lot of evidence that that's true, and one of the things in the modern world that we have to look at is we're being exposed to more and more pain just as a result of science and technology. We probably see on our internet screens, newspapers, and television screens more in a week than your great-grandfather would have seen in a decade. And we haven't yet evolved as a culture enough to teach people how to sit with that amount of kind of constant flow of pain and horror that's being shared with us from all around the world. And so we tend to do things that are pretty unhealthy, I think, to turn away from that, to self-soothe in ways that are not healthy. And so pain is part of life. Finding a way to deal with that in a healthy way is sort of the pivot point between entanglement and happiness, I believe.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good start with Dr. Hayes. After this brief break, we're going to go ahead and explore a little bit further this whole idea of how can we find true health and true happiness. Hello and welcome back. We're talking with Dr. Stephen Hayes from the University of Nevada, who is the author of this really good book, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, which really encapsulates and guides people through the processes that Dr. Hayes is talking about with us today. So Steve, I was wondering, we kind of touched on what is the culture telling us about who we are, about pain and suffering and happiness and health. Could you expand on that a little bit more, please?
The two most toxic things that the culture gives us, I believe, is in addition to this challenge of a constant flow of pain and also a constant flow of judgment and criticism of others in our shoutcasts that are called the newscasts, and sort of you can see it in our politics, you can see it in just watching our cable news and so forth, is that I think we're being taught that a feel-good life is a live-good life. And there's too many ways that science and technology are developing ways to, quote, feel good that are not necessarily good, in the form of, distractions, medications we may not need, in the form of commercial images of if you have the right beer, the right car, the right partner, the right amount of money, and so forth. What has happened at the same time is the traditions in the culture that used to teach us to sit with distress in small amounts for a larger purpose, to have compassion for others, to see the world through the eyes of others, and to focus on our values. Those institutions have weakened. So we have greater challenges, weaker institutions, and we're kind of living the results. I think you can see it in our young, you can see it in our culture. This is harming people.
I'm wondering, when you talk, Steve, about how maybe at an earlier time in our culture we were taught to sit and be with some pain. And
yes.
Is this a character issue? Does this have to do with the character of American culture, or the character of individual people, or the character of families?
I don't know if character is the right word, but it's a challenge of the modern culture. We've created, for example, let's take the exposure to pain and horror comes in part from this wonderful communications technology we've invented. But now your 3-year-old is being exposed to images, then you can't turn off the television set or the computer screen fast enough, completely eliminated. And when they get older, they're going to see these things, even if you threw all of the television sets out of the window. And so part of it, there's been a hardening of the culture, I believe, not because of character, but because of the challenges we've created, oddly, through our great technological and scientific advances. And then the culture hasn't evolved quickly enough to catch up with it. And I think some of the other things that used to provide a weight against it, for example, social clubs or spiritual and religious traditions, I think, are changing. The amount of reliance that people have on methods that produce compassion, some small amounts of distress. Can I give you an example?
Yes, please.
When I was raised, most religious traditions had small amounts of things you did for a larger purpose that were difficult. You gave up things on certain days. You couldn't eat meat on Fridays for a Catholic, for example. You went through periods of time when you were fasting. You were on your knees regularly. When you're a little kid, you couldn't understand kind of what that was. But part of what it gave you is my mother used to say, offer it up, offer it up. And she said, you should use this to connect with the suffering of others. And so it was put into a meaningful context. So much of that has now been stripped out. And we have a commercial culture that is pushing feel good, feel good, feel good all the time. Yeah. And it's no wonder, I think, that our kids, sort of push away from it with the, X Games, just do it. Yeah. They try to go in the other direction because they see that this is nothing but treacle to drink, and we know that's not really an answer either. So neither suppression nor indulgence is an answer. How do we find a middle path? And I think we're trying to find a way as a culture as to how to do that.
So are you saying too, so on one hand, there are these religious institutions or these psychological systems that encourage people to give themselves to something greater than themselves, but are you saying, though, that sometimes the problem that creates more suffering, Steve, is this idea of me first?
Exactly.
That I'm really not living for anything greater than myself. It just, how can I feel good right now?
And so why you have to look at why are things like purpose-driven life and so forth so popular right now? Some of these things is because people are yearning for a way to look at what is my purpose, why am I here? And spiritual and religious traditions are part of it, but the whole culture has that responsibility. Are we here for just for ourselves or for the good of others? Do we have compassion for others? And can we sit with some small amount of pain and difficulty as part of living a values-driven life? And those are the things that we know just from the science of it, help people stand up to the challenges of this flow of pain and of judgment that the modern world has put into our lives.
Yeah. And I think in this last minute of this segment, Steve, what are your thoughts on this? It seems like the more we focus on our pain and how much we want it to go away, the worse it gets.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, when we are engaged in life, we're engaged in making a positive difference, the aches and pains, whether they're physical or psychological, just don't seem to be that great. Could you comment on that in this last minute?
Well, isn't that odd? If you have this idea that when the pain goes away, I can start living, you're never going to get to the second phase.
Yes.
Conversely, if you can find a way to focus on living a valued life, including for others, these pains that you have that come as part of a natural process of living assume a more normal proportion of your life, and they actually seem less important.
Yes.
You don't put life on hold waiting for your sadness to go away, your anger to go away, your depression to go away.
Great. Excellent information. And after this brief break, we're going to talk with Dr. Hayes about what do Chinese handcuffs have to do with all of this. We'll see you right after the break. Hello and welcome back to New Skills for Living. We're talking with Dr. Stephen Hayes, the author of this really wonderful book, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life. And one of the things we wanted to talk with Dr. Hayes about was this idea of Chinese handcuffs. And what does that have to do with being healthy and being happy? So, Dr. Hayes, can you guide us through that, please?
Well, if you've never played with one of those toys before, I just gave one to my 4-year-old, and he put his fingers in, started to pull it out, and then almost in a panic realized he couldn't get them out. Yeah. And of course, everything in his mind told him to get out, you had to pull it out. So he pulled harder and harder and harder. He's a little guy, and even those fairly flimsy straw things prevented him from doing that. It's a metaphor, but a metaphor for something that I think is pretty profound and is supported by what we know from the evidence, which is, sometimes if you lean into things, you have more room to move, and you have the room to actually move ahead and have issues drop away. Conversely, if you're fighting with them in an unhealthy way, they become the central focus of your life.
Can I ask you real quick?
They tend to grow and grow.
From your perspective, when we're fighting it, that we're either trying to avoid something or we're trying to control it. Is that correct?
Exactly.
And when you say lean into it, you're saying just be with it.
Just be with it, although one of the things I want to caution, and the reason a book like this is important, but not this, there's several books within this tradition that walk through this, is these are skills you have to learn because your logical mind will hear, well, I need to lean into it. How do I do that? Part of what we need to do is be more mindful even of that. Get a little bit of distance between all this chatterbox between our ears, which is full of those television images and all of those painful things we were just talking about, and to learn to be more mindful, to sit with what's going on in your body, what kind of emotions are rising and falling, to watch your thoughts come and go, and then amid all of that, to focus on what you can do with your feet that would move you towards the kind of life that you want to live. And so there's skills that have to be learned, not just concepts that have to be heard and applied.
I see.
And that's what the book will do, is it'll walk you through these kinds of exercises and skills that will allow you to let go, not just as a concept, but as an actual process in the moment when things arise that are difficult.
Of course, you've worked with thousands of patients, and I was wondering, can you give us an example of how you've used this concept with a patient of yours who is suffering?
Well, I'm thinking right now of a person who, a young person who was so afraid socially, would get so anxious around others that she tended to say no to any kind of invitation to be part of things, and was became more and more and more withdrawn, and was both anxious and depressed as a result. Part of the irony there is the reason why she was so concerned is she wanted to be with people.
Yes.
That was part of why she was afraid, because she wanted that. And the solution that her mind gave her was it was safer to be away from people. So this is a very common thing, and this is something that any listener knows about.
Yeah.
If you were ever betrayed in a love relationship, for example, when you were young, those early moments, those early relationships, almost all of us have had that thought of, I'll never be so vulnerable again. Meaning, I will keep people away. I'll put a wall around me. But the reason it hurt is because I wanted to be with people. I wanted to be loved. I wanted to have intimacy. Yeah? So it's the natural response of the human mind is to try to control pain. It's part of what it evolved to do. But it'll do it even when it harms your life and prevents you from moving towards what you most value. So with the young person I'm thinking of, we taught these kinds of acceptance and mindfulness skills, and she learned to sort of be gentler with herself, to carry that anxiety into her social interactions, and to see them actually as a sign that she cared about others and wanted to be with others, rather than a sign that she had to withdraw from others.
That's an excellent example. And again, Dr. Hayes mentioned his book, and I want to point this out to you again. It's available at the major bookstores. You can get it online through Amazon. And we'll talk more with Dr. Hayes about these really important concepts right after this brief break. Hello, and welcome back to New Skills for Living. We're talking with the author of Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life. And Steve, we were talking during the break that there was that song that said, teach your children well.
Yeah.
What would you share with us for the parents out there and for the grandparents right now watching? What can you share with them about how some of these concepts can be taught or how they can be used with the younger generation?
Well, you know, there's some evidence on what age gives you in terms of wisdom, and people will say things like, don't sweat the small things and so forth. You begin to put things in perspective. And I think ironically with our children, sometimes we hide the fact that life is difficult and there are pains and difficulties, and present a more coping model. I think in order to avoid scaring our children and maybe thinking that it would be too hard for them, but in fact I would go in the other direction. I think part of what we need to teach our children, and what they know full well, because you look at how often children cry, they are right up against the fact that just the normal process of a day includes things that are painful, is that it is all right to feel pain, and that life does present these things, but we can find a place to put it that is compassionate with ourselves, compassionate towards others, and then values-based. And I think we've been almost irresponsible sometimes in how we've presented models to our children that won't hold up when they have difficulties later on.
Yeah. So we could actually be teaching them to try to avoid pain at any cost and try to be like stoic or buck up or go get loaded or something.
Exactly. I think we do it all the time, just because children learn more from by watching us and what we actually do than by what just comes out of our mouth. And important place there is for a person who is struggling with anxiety, depression, or substances, thinking that this is going to harm their children. No, it isn't. What's going to harm the children is watching you walk through those processes in a way that's unhealthy. And so part of your job is to really look seriously at what your experience tells you, to reach out, to find better ways, and to allow your children in to see that. and to then use that to sort of help them through some of these smaller challenges they'll face as a young person. But the single biggest thing is by what we model.
Yeah.
So if, for example, we're dealing with a sadness of loss, if there's a loved one who, walking through that in a way that's respectful of the pain involved in that, and brings the children in so that you can see that that's a path you need to walk, but yet is connected to the values part of it, like the celebration that we do when people have passed away of the good things that they stood for. Children need to see that too, and see that it is possible to walk this path between indulgence and suppression, and to live a human life with its difficulties and still walk a valued path.
So in terms of like being models for our children, I hear you saying, please correct me if I'm wrong, kind of like being emotionally available, and it's knowing that being emotional is not a weakness. In fact, it's a strong man or a strong woman who's able, when we're able to access our emotions in an authentic way and share that with our children.
Absolutely. And to walk through them in a healthy way. So this process of acceptance, which I think was really kind of self-compassion, linked to also compassion towards others, teaching children to see there is suffering in the world, and that's part of their job to step up to that, and then also to find in there the values that they will represent in the moments they'll spend on this planet, and how they spend their lives in one behavior or another, and what you actually do in life, and focus on that, carrying the rest with them towards these painful experiences. I like to use the metaphor, even some of the things, our biggest struggles are sort of like a dried flower, and we're being asked to sort of carry it with care, instead of trying to throw away our own history, which is so anti-life and so has a lack of self-compassion. We can't throw away our histories and push away the things that have happened to us. We have to carry that forward towards a life worth living.
That's a great image. That's a great image, Stephen. Well, it's been really great to have Dr. Stephen Hayes with us. We want to ask you to join us again where we explore another topic, looking at acceptance and commitment therapy. And of course, these shows are available online. That website is up on your screen.